Welcome to the podcast. On today's episode, Michael of Our Blessed Lady. Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you for taking time out of your day to spend a few moments with us on the podcast. Today is another story edition of the podcast, and as the intro suggested, it's about someone named Michael of Our Blessed Lady. Michael was born in December of 1503 to a notary named Jack and the daughter of a prominent physician in the south of France. Her name was Rainier Saint Remy. His family was Jewish. However, his grandfather on his father's side, perhaps seeking greater opportunities in France, decided to fully embrace the culture and even decided to convert to Catholicism. And in order to show his zeal for his new faith and country, he chose as his new last name the name of the saint associated with the day of his baptism. It was the day the French venerated the Virgin Mary, so Crescus, a grain and money dealer, became Pierre of Our Blessed Lady, literally taking the day as his last name. From his grandfather on his mother's side, young Michael developed a deep interest in medicine, which led him to a lifelong passion for the study of natural and traditional remedies, which he studied on his free time as a hobby. After college, however, he spent the next 8 years traveling Europe, researching and documenting everything he could learn about natural remedies. It was only after these 8 years of passionate study that he decided to enroll in a very highly respected doctoral program in medicine. And although he did very well during his time there, he was eventually asked to leave by the school because of his previous work and research in herbal and natural remedies, which was considered a field of study unsuitable for a modern medical university, even in the 16th century. A few years later, Michael met and fell deeply in love with a woman named Henriette, who he married and had 2 children with. By all accounts, it was a very happy time for Michael, who also found it a time of deep strengthening of his growing Christian faith, which was passed down to him by his grandfather Pierre. Unfortunately, it was not to last. After only 3 years of marriage, his wife and his youngest child both died of the Black Plague that began sweeping across Europe at that time. Motivated by his deep sadness and his faith, Michael decided to put all his effort into saving as many people as he could from the plague that took his family, and he began working tirelessly, treating local residents, putting his years of education and self-training into action. Amazingly, Michael became very famous as a result of his incredible record of successfully treating patients with the plague and the very low death rate of those in his care. History tells us that he accomplished this through the use of something he invented called the rose pill or the pink pill, which he gave to all his patients. In addition to the pill, he also introduced groundbreaking alternative medical techniques, such as requiring that his patients wash regularly and eat a low-fat diet. This is no joke. In fact, the pink or rose pill just mentioned, well, it was pink because it was taken from rose hips, which you may know are extremely high in vitamin C, which in modern times we all know to take whenever we feel a cold coming on. Even with the incredible success of saving so many lives, due to the nature of his work, he was constantly surrounded by death and the grieving families of those who could not be saved. And eventually, the pain and depression of losing his wife and young child returned and brought with it new anxieties about the future and his understanding of what happens when you die. Unfortunately, this is where Michael's life takes a dramatic turn. Because of his inability to find any satisfying answers from the Christians who surrounded him, Michael began searching other avenues which promised knowledge about the future and the afterlife. He began deeply studying occult practices which promised such answers, and history tells us one of the methods he embraced was staring in a bowl full of water for long periods of time, waiting to receive visions of the future. When something came to mind, he would write it down as a 4-line poem, which he called a quatrain, writing in such a way that the predictions would not be easily understood until after the event had occurred. In the centuries after his death, Michael of Our Blessed Lady, which by now I am sure you have guessed is my own rather direct translation from his French name, and you'll have to forgive my pronunciation, was Michel du Nostre Damus. In English, however, you likely know him simply by his last name, Nostradamus, the man who has been credited with predicting everything from the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 to the rise of Hitler in the 1930s, and even events still unfolding today. Now, the events of this story are in fact 100% true, and I hope you found that Nostradamus was in fact a much more interesting individual than he's generally given credit for. But his story, as I have crafted it for today's podcast, is, I believe, supremely relevant to those of us here in December of 2016. The greater story of Nostradamus' life is really a story about anxiety, and especially anxiety about the future, which, just as in Nostradamus' case, can make any of us susceptible to deception and vulnerable to false teachings. That's why in a time when anxiety about the future seems to be a national problem, I believe this story and the biblical principles Nostradamus couldn't find are exactly what we need to stay protected. The story, as we have told it today, actually ends where most people believe it begins, but looking only at his prophetic misadventures obscures the fact that he only ended up there as part of a search for answers prompted as a result of living through one of the most trying periods of human history. I hope you found the backstory as interesting as I did, but the reason I shared it with you is because it stands to remind us that there are incredible people with outstanding insight and gifts that are yearning for someone they do not yet know. Romans chapter 10, verse 14 says, "But how can they call on him to save them unless they believe in him? And how can they believe in him if they have never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them?" Studies regularly show that committed Christians generally experience less anxiety than those who are not. I believe that this is at least in part because we believe the church has received prophetic insights about the future that have been so accurate that even unbelievers have struggled for centuries to find some kind of evidence to disprove them, but to no avail. The best they can usually do is to just ignore them. And this is exactly the reason that God has given them to us. John 14:29 says, "I have told you these things before they happen, so that when they do happen, you will believe." In your life, you will meet numerous incredibly gifted individuals, and likely even more who have yet to discover their gifts. And living in a time of such high anxiety, there has never been a better time to be prepared to share the insights into life's biggest questions that Nostradamus couldn't find. We have been counseled in 1 Peter 3:15, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and with respect." Well, that's it for today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope you'll join us again for the next one, coming up soon.